This table seems simple. After all, it's made from some pretty basic preschool level shapes, but simplicity always has a catch.
Awesome.
To start this project, I did what I always do and talked to my client about what they're looking for and why. And in this case, they wanted an antique table to match their existing dining table, but to make it in a cricket style, which has 3 legs instead of 4. Oh, and to make it in white oak. Now this board might not look like white oak, but underneath all that dirt, I can clearly see some medullary rays, which is why I picked this board in particular out of the stack at the lumberyard. And I'm not going to go into what those rays are, but I did write an article about them a while back, so I'll put a link to that in the description if you're curious. But what the rays indicate is that the boards are quarter sawn. And there's a couple of reasons why that's important. The first being this board will be more stable, moving a little less with the seasons, and it'll do it in a more predictable way across its width, and it won't cup like a plain sawn board. And the second is those rays will give the piece a more traditional look, which is exactly what I'm going for with this piece. And now that the boards are broken down into rough length, it's time to mill them. Oh, and I broke the boards down because milling shorter boards is easier and it requires less material to be removed than longer boards. And since I don't have a jointer, I'm going to use this sled, shim the boards, flatten one side, then flip it over and do the other side. Since I have a separate video detailing this whole process, I'm not going to go through it in detail in this one, but if you noticed, the fence on my planer sled went first, and I didn't use any hot glue, so go check that out if you're interested, but for now, I'm going to get to work on the rest of these boards. The next step of the milling process is to establish a flat edge that's perpendicular to the face of the board, and since I still don't have a jointer, I'm going to use my router table, which is honestly just as easy to use as a jointer, if not a little easier with wide boards like the ones that I'm using for this project. And if you don't have a router table with this feature, you can simply tape a shim to the outfeed side of your router fence, and that'll work just fine. And finally, we made it to the last step of milling to surface the final side, which I'm going to do with the table saw, to rip an edge parallel to the one I just jointed, which makes these boards ready for glue up. Now there's a lot of things you can do to ensure your glue up stays flat, like using dominoes or biscuits or dowels, but I'm not going to do any of those because it's honestly usually a waste of time, and if you've done a good job milling, your boards are going to go together just fine. And if there's any unevenness later, well, I'll show you how to fix it. My typical workflow on a project is to get all the panels done first, set them aside, and then start on whatever base or whatever I need to do next. Now, this is not normal because the base is giving me a little bit of an issue at this point, so I'm going to forge forward by turning this top into a circle first, and to do that I'm using the circle jig to establish the final size of the tabletop. And after a quick dusting, I'll remove the excess with a jigsaw. This step is probably my least favorite of cutting circles, but it's necessary so the router cuts cleaner in the next passes, which will save me time in the long run from having to waste it on patching repairs to fix tear out or sanding out burn marks or something like that. The next step is to route everything so it's nice and flush with that original pass, and I'm going to do this with 2 different bits. The first being a template bit to remove some of the material and make it easier to follow with my flush trim bit. But while I do that, I have a confession I have to make. When I took on this project, I thought it would be way easier than it was, and I do that a lot. It seems like I'm always underestimating how much time and brain power goes into these projects. Now, I've been making furniture for clients for the past 3 years, and I've begun to learn my lesson, which is why when I quoted this project, I did something a little sneaky. I added a premium to the price to make up for the fact that I would spend a few hours fixing some unforeseen mistake. Now, I'm not sure if that's the right way to handle it, so I'm asking you, what do you do in your line of work to account for extra mistakes and having to fix them? Is it normal to have a buffer, or do I need to work on my estimating skills? Speaking of things that take longer than they should, I mentioned during glue up that I didn't use any alignment aids, and my boards ended up just a little bit off. So I'm going to use a combination of hand planes to completely flatten this table, starting with a jointing plane to smooth out any major high spots, and move over to a smoothing plane to clean everything up. And in my experience, panels generally need some type of flattening, so this really isn't a big deal. And it's honestly a pretty enjoyable process, especially with these old school wooden hand planes, which these days I'm reaching for more often because they feel nice in your hands and give you a surprising amount of control, which seems odd since you adjust them by smacking them with a hammer. Okay, so I mentioned earlier my client gave me a few requirements, which seem simple enough. 3 legs, round top, overall size, and match their antique dining table. Simple, right? So for one of the design elements, I'm going to add an edge profile with 2 router bits. The first being a grooving bit, which is going to cut a rabbet all the way around the table, and the second is a simple roundover. But the thing is, simple is never that simple. And that's the reason why I started with the top on this one, is because I have a problem that I have to solve before I can start the base. And I've been noodling on it in the background, but I haven't solved it yet. So now that I have no other option, I have to head inside and think this one over. But inside, I have a new problem. Well, not really new. It's this old chair. I've had it for about 15 years or so, and it's wearing out, which not only looks bad, but also has been causing me some back pain, which is why I'm happy that FlexiSpot agreed to sponsor this video and send me their C7 ergonomic chair. When I opened up the box, the C7 has all sorts of bells and whistles and lots of parts, which made me nervous to put it together, but in reality, it was a snap. And in no time, I had it adjusted and ready, but the chair alone didn't solve my problem. Or so I thought. Now, I don't know about you, but when I'm working on a complicated problem, sometimes I just need to take a step back. And the C7 isn't called ergonomic for nothing. It has this cool footrest feature I've never seen on any other office chair. It allowed me to sit back, relax, and think without being distracted by pain and discomfort. And that's all I needed to figure it out. So thank you FlexiSpot for not only sponsoring this video, but also for enabling me to work like new. Alright, so the problem. Typically my furniture is made out of squares, and squares are easy because all the angles are 90 degrees, but this base is a triangle and all the angles are 60 degrees, which is going to make my math and my typical operations hard to do. Now the easy thing to do would be to make the legs all small triangles to match the base, but the problem is the stretcher would then come in at a weird angle and it'd be hard to get everything to fit. Typically this wouldn't be a problem, but in this case it does make for some complicated joinery. And since I'm already planning on doing mortise and tenons, I didn't want that extra headache. So instead, I did some research and figured out I need to make this shape, which makes the interior portions of the legs parallel to each other so that the stretcher can be square. And now you can see how this shape works. If I put the mortise here, it can be cut straight down into the leg and the stretcher's tenon can be made normally. But it also means now I have to figure out how to make this shape with all the correct angles. So I did the math and this is what I came up with. But the second trick is to figure out how big the stock needs to be to cut the shape out of. And it turns out is 1 3/4 inch by 1.5 inch. And then of course the third and final trick is to figure out how to cut it. But I'll leave that for later and instead I'll address a different problem that I created.
So when I was cutting all of my boards down, I didn't realize at the time that my leg blank was not going to be thick enough. I didn't find that out until I went in and figured it all out. So I am lucky and I had an extra board that I milled off. So I'm going to go ahead and get this board ready so I can laminate these two together and start cutting the legs.
This is the type of thing that always bites me when I don't do a full 3D model before I build a piece of furniture, but you know what? I spend enough time on the computer, it's hard for me to pull myself back on in the evenings when I could be enjoying my time in the shop instead. So I'm going to just go ahead and make this board a little thicker than it was before, and anytime I do this, I like to give the boards a little bit of a wiggle, which helps the board stick together before clamping pressure so they won't move as much. Now, I won't show you more milling, and I'll jump straight to cutting these legs down to final length before moving on to solve the final leg quandary of this video, how to cut all of those angles I showed you a little bit ago. I've set this bevel gauge to 60 degrees and will draw the exact shape I want right on the workpiece, and then I'll order my cuts. The first is going to be this long one because there will still be a flat spot to rest on the table if I do this one first. The second cut will remove that flat spot, but I'll be flipping the board so it has a different 90-degree angle to slide along the saw and the fence. And if that's confusing, trust me, I'm right there with you. I was confused when I saw this on a New Yankee Workshop video and had to rewatch it a few times, which is why I'm trying to really explain this so it's hopefully easier for you to understand. So rather than tell you, now I'm going to show you. This first cut has that meaty flat bottom to support it all the way through the cut, and then after flipping the workpiece, I can leave the saw blade exactly where it's at the same angle and just adjust the fence for the second cut. Now, I'm not saying Norm was wrong here, but I do think this method is a little safer than what he did and a little easier for me to wrap my head around. The next step is to start making the joinery, and given the weird shape of these legs, I can't simply plunge route like I typically would for making mortises, so instead I'm going to do a router table drop and stop cut. To set up this operation, it's as simple as marking the edges of the bits on the fence and then marking the ends of the tenon on the legs. Line those two up and drop the workpiece down into the router bit, slide it forward until the stop mark lines up, and then flip the whole thing around to cut the mortises on the other side from the opposite direction, and boom! We're done and ready to make the stretchers and the tenons. In my last video, I also made mortise and tenons, and I received a question asking how to determine the thickness of the tenon, which I totally forgot to show. So I'm going to show it here. And it starts with taking the workpiece and lining it up in the middle of the mortise, and then marking each edge, and then validating those marks with a caliper, which I'm going to then use to set up the height of the saw blade. I'm going to use a cross-cut sled at the table saw to cut all of these tenons, and it's going to take a few passes with this flat ground blade, which is really essential to make sure that it's nice and flat and you don't have to do too much cleaning up after the fact. But the alternative is to set up a dado stack, and that's a lot of extra work, especially for how small these tenons are really going to be. So I'm going to check real quick to make sure that I have my settings right, and then I'll measure the depth of the mortise so I can set up a stop block. Now, one thing you might notice is I'm using a lot of measuring tools, and that's because tools like calipers and a combination square lock in measurements so I don't have to remember them, and I also don't have to sight them by eye. And if you want to invest in a marking tool, then I suggest going with a combination square because it's the most versatile and I find myself using it all the time. But with that, the tenons have their faces done, so let's turn off the noisy machines and head over to use some hand tools. Here's a lesson that took me a while to learn. Despite me using a machine to cut the mortises, each one is just a little bit different in length, so I'm going to mark each tenon with the mortise that it'll go into, and then cut it to fit. I also label each mortise and tenon so I know which one goes together, and a trick I do to know which way they face is by putting the label so that the letter or number is always the right side up in the mortise and in the tenon. Finally, I just want to mention why I round the tenons instead of square the mortises, and it's because I can round a tenon in 3 to 4 chisel cuts, which is actually pretty fast to do. I'm not sure how long it would take me to square a mortise, but maybe someday I'll do a bake-off between the two methods. And in no time, it's time for dry fit. Okay, well, luckily I haven't sanded yet. As evidenced earlier, I prefer not to measure when I can avoid it, which is why I'm putting this whole base on the panel that will become the lower shelf and just tracing the legs, so I know exactly how big to cut the triangle, and then I'm going to use those scribe lines that I made on the inside of those legs to notch the shelf so it fits perfectly in place. Now we finally made it to the final detail phase of the project, where the legs get tapered, the edges get rounded, and I spend about 4 hours sanding, but I'll go ahead and show you about 4 seconds of that so we can skip forward to the final assembly. While I spread some glue and ratchet this thing closed, you've made it this far into the video, which means you're properly invested, and I can share some news with you. So I recently decided to leave my full-time job. I was planning on waiting to do this until the channel was a lot bigger, but things happened and I needed to make a change, which is why I'm asking for your support. Now, there's some simple things you can do, like this video, leave me a comment, and just let me know that you're supporting me. Not only does that help the video reach more people, it also lets me know that I've made the right decision and am having a positive impact on this community. And the second thing is, and it's totally not expected, but if you feel like it, I started a Patreon account where you can sign up and support me financially. Patreon is new to me, but I'll be building that site up to give members some exclusive behind-the-scenes content and access to courses that I'll be offering on my website. And if you don't feel like committing to Patreon, no worries, no pressure. but you can check out my site where I have a few products for sale and am building out some new courses to teach woodworkers techniques and skills I wished I learned sooner. Now, there's only one out there so far, but there's going to be more coming soon. But most of all, thanks for watching and making it this far, and I hope it's been good enough to earn your subscription. Alright, enough of that, and back to the video. What I'm doing here is beveling the feet, which is important to do on all furniture as the sharp edges can get caught as the tables move around, and it can cause the wood to catch and splinter and tear chunks out. And the final piece is to secure these corner braces. Oh, shoot. I didn't show you how to make these. Okay, so I decided to go with a simple, quick option for these because they aren't really structural and are really just there to hold the top on. So I'm using pocket hole joinery to hold them in place and then drilling some elongated holes so that I can sink screws through here, which will allow them to move back and forth with seasonal wood movement. Now, I don't often use pocket hole joinery, but you know what? It's a tool in the tool bag, and it all has a time and place. And in this instance, it's really all these corner braces need. With those done, it's finally time for finish, which starts with a two-part staining process. The first of which is a homemade emnizing solution called iron acetate, which is going to react with the tannic white oak and turn it black. Following that is a brown stain, and the combination of these two is going to give a really nice depth and richness in the color. Now, I mentioned I've been creating courses, and this is one of the courses I'm going to create on my website, so check it out when it's ready. I'm not quite there yet, but it's a pretty cool finishing process, and it turns out really nice, and is honestly not that hard to do. And speaking of not that hard to do, I'm going to apply my favorite hard wax oil as a top coat. That's Natura One Coat. It's a really fabulous product, super easy to apply, and very affordable compared to other hard wax oils. I can't recommend this stuff enough. So if you're interested, there's a link down in the description where you can buy it yourself. I mean, look at that. It's a simple wipe on, wipe off, and then you're done. With the finish dry, it's time to put this one together and close the project out. And as I do that, I want to revisit the idea that surrounded this entire build. It's simple. A simple form, a simple design, but when you peek beneath those simple layers, you begin to realize there's a lot more to it. We try our best to make everything look easy, but it never is. Every decision you make, every task you complete, it takes thought, it takes time. And it builds on your stress. And over the years, that stress has been building on me. All those long hours and the pressure to deliver drove me to seek the simpler things in life, which is why I'm finally ready to stop, walk away, and start on this new journey.